Hello and welcome back to Entering the Infinite, the Magic the Gathering podcast all about infinite combos. I am your host, Aaron Bennick. Apologies for the week delay. I had recorded this episode, but then in saving it and trying to upload it, somehow all of the audio got corrupted, so unfortunately I wasn't able to make the deadline for last week. But I'm here, I'm back, and I've got a sweet episode. The previous episode was Unctus Grand Metatech, a sweet mono blue commander from Phyrexia All Will Be One. Go ahead, check that out. This week, I'm continuing Phyrexia All Will Be One commanders in Slobad Iron Goblin. Slobad is 2 and a red for a legendary creature, a Phyrexian Goblin Artificer. Slobad is a 3/3, and he says, tap, sacrifice an artifact, add an amount of red mana equal to the sacrificed artifact's mana value. Spend this mana only to cast artifact spells or activate abilities of artifacts. This ability is super sweet, but before I start gushing about it, let's get into the first impressions. So my first impression about Slobad is that he's very cheaply costed. He only costs 2 and a red. So you can play a couple of artifacts before him, even, and then play him, and then maybe by turn 3 in some cases, turn 4, you can already start powering out a lot of things onto your board. The other thing that I really like about him, and I actually didn't realize this when I first built the deck, is I had thought that his ability was a red tap and sacrifice. So I spent a while trying to figure out how to get additional mana in order to reactivate his ability, and then I reread the card, and his ability is only tap sacrifice. Tapping things and sacrificing things is so incredibly abusable, and especially in such a wide variety of cards that you have access to in Commander, because untapping things is so super easy, and bringing things back so that you can sacrifice them again is also super easy. And Slobad is just a mana sink, so he's an enabler. He just lets you do all kinds of super broken stuff. The last impression about Slobad is that you can only use the mana for artifacts. So when I was making the deck, like I said, I thought that his ability cost a red and tap. So I was kind of in my head, I was like, well, now I have to turn Slobad into an artifact, so then I can use the red mana in order to re-tap him and untap him and all that. But the red mana only being used for artifacts or activated abilities of artifacts is not really that much of a downside, because when you combo with artifacts is really all you have. Artifacts combo in a vacuum. So the fact that this mana can only be spent to use artifacts or activate abilities of artifacts is not a downside, because that's all we care to activate, cast, and combo out with anyway. And speaking of combos, let's get into the main combos. So a very large amount of combos in this deck are super, super interchangeable. And I specifically made it that way because red lacks the ability to consistently find pieces of anything, really. Red lacks tutors. I'll get more into that later, but so many of the pieces are interchangeable, so this is going to be a very long combo section. And I'm going to just start out with a single card here in Dross Scorpion. So Dross Scorpion is a 4-mana artifact creature. It's a Scorpion. It's a 3/1. And it says, whenever a Dross Scorpion or another artifact creature is put into a graveyard from play, you may untap target artifact. So, untapping artifacts, right? There's lots and lots and lots of artifacts that we want to untap here. One artifact that we would love to untap is Slobad Iron Goblin. And you can turn him into an artifact super easily. I'm playing Mycos and Thladis, which is 6 mana for an artifact. All permanents are artifacts in addition to their other types. All cards that aren't on the battlefield, spells and permanents are colorless. Players may spend mana as though it were mana of any color. And the Liquid Metal Torque. It's 2 mana for an artifact. Tap, add colorless. Tap, target non-land permanent becomes an artifact in addition to its other types until end of turn. So both of those cards are going to be pretty heavily used in this deck in order to turn Slobad into an artifact so that he has the ability to untap with some of the other cards. But for right now, just talking about the Draw Scorpion. So now we have Slobad. He's an artifact. So Draw Scorpion can untap Slobad. Now all we need is artifact creatures specifically, to go into the graveyard in order to then untap things. So Slobad, Draw Scorpion, Slobad as an artifact, and 2 retrieving creatures. That's what I'm calling them. So Junk Diver, Mirror Retriever, Workshop Assistant. Each of these are different creatures with different stats, different types, different costs, but they all have the important text that just say, when they die, return another artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. So any 2 of these retrieving creatures and all of the other pieces that I've mentioned makes an infinite loop. So you can sacrifice the Junk Diver. You make 2 Slobad, specifically. You make 3 mana. Junk Diver returns Mirror Retriever. So you put Mirror Retriever back into your hand. Well, Draw Scorpion says an artifact creature, the Junk Diver, went to the graveyard. So now you get to untap an artifact. And Slobad is an artifact. So you untap the Slobad, and then with the 3 mana that you've gained from sacrificing the Junk Diver, now you can cast the Mirror Retriever. You have 1 left over. So then you can tap Slobad again, sacrifice the Mirror Retriever, getting back the Junk Diver in your hand, and Draw Scorpion, untap Slobad again. And now you have 3 mana to play the Junk Diver. So this combo works with any 2 of the retrievers. So Junk Diver is 3, Mirror Retriever is 2, Workshop Assistant is 3. Works with any 2 of them. And then you just have that infinite loop that just keeps recurring those artifacts. You don't make infinite mana off of this loop just because the retrievers have to pay for their own costs in order to play them. But you still get infinite enter the battlefield and leave the battlefield triggers with your artifacts, which is important later when I get to some of the other win conditions. But for now, we're just going through the combos. So you take this exact combo, this exact set, this exact shell, Slobad, Lattice, Draw Scorpion, 2 retrievers, and replace Slobad with Goblin Welder. And I'm gonna pull up the Oracle text here really quick. Goblin Welder. So Goblin Welder is a single red for creature, a Goblin Artificer. It's a 1/1. It says tap, choose target artifact a player controls and target artifact card in that player's graveyard. If both targets are still legal as this ability resolves, that player simultaneously sacrifices the artifact and returns the artifact card to the battlefield. So Goblin Welder basically says tap, swap an artifact in the graveyard, and swap an artifact on the battlefield. So if Goblin Welder is also an artifact, then Draw Scorpion can untap the Goblin Welder every time you tap and sacrifice stuff with the Goblin Welder. So that is also infinite enter the battlefield and leave the battlefield trigger with the Goblin Welder. So that's Draw Scorpion and a bunch of different stuff that he untaps. And there's loads of other cool stuff that the Draw Scorpion can do in this deck, especially when comboed with the Mycosynth Lattice to turn everything into artifacts. But there are also other cards, specifically one other card that untaps artifacts that can really help you go infinite. And it is the Clock of Omens. It's 4 mana for an artifact. It says tap 2 untapped artifacts you control, untap target artifact. Now, Clock of Omens does require a little bit more work. And by more work, I actually mean less pieces. So Draw Scorpion goes helps to go infinite with a larger variety of cards in the deck, but Clock of Omens is really limited to only a couple of them. One of them that's very, very important is the Spine of Ish-Sa. It is 7 mana for an artifact. It says when Spine of Ish-Sa enters the battlefield, destroy target permanent. When Spine of Ish-Sa is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return Spine of Ish-Sa to its owner's hand. So the reason that you specifically need the Spine is you can sacrifice it to Slobad. It comes back into your hand, and then you can put it back into play because you just made 7 mana off of sacrificing the Spine of Ish-Sa. So what this means is that the Spine will enter untapped every single time. So all you need now is a card, is an artifact, that untaps itself whenever the Spine gets put into the graveyard or enters the battlefield. And there are quite a few cards that do this. The first one is the Summoning Station, which is 7 mana for an artifact. It says tap, put a 2/2 colorless pincher token creature into play. And it says whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from play, you may untap Summoning Station. So you can untap the Summoning Station whenever Spine of Ish-Sa comes into play. So if Slobad is an artifact, which we've already established is very important, so just always assume that that Lattice is in play and Slobad is an artifact. So you actually need to do this just a little bit backwards because of the way that Summoning Station works. So you want to assume Slobad is already tapped. Maybe you've sacrificed an Ichor Wellspring or something like that to just draw a card. So you tap Summoning Station and Spine of Ish-Sa to Clock of Omens to untap Slobad. Then you can sacrifice the Spine to Slobad. The Summoning Station will untap, and then you can play the Spine with the 7 mana that you just made from sacrificing it, tap both of them to untap Slobad, and you can keep going like that. The other cards that work with the Spine of Ish-Sa Clock of Omens thing, one of them is the Grinding Station. Grinding Station is 2 mana for an artifact. It says tap, sacrifice an artifact. Target player puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. Whenever an artifact comes into play, you may untap Grinding Station. So you tap Slobad, sacrifice the Spine of Ish-Sa, make 7. You replay the Spine. Grinding Station will untap itself. You tap the Spine and the Grinding Station to untap Slobad. You continue doing that. Another card with similar wording to Grinding Station is the Battered Golem. Battered Golem is 3 mana. For an artifact creature, a golem, it's a 3/2. It says Battered Golem doesn't untap during your untap step, and whenever an artifact comes into play, you may untap Battered Golem. So it has the same wording as the Grinding Station. So doing that, you have the ability to sacrifice the Spine, replay the Spine, the Battered Golem will untap, tap the Battered Golem and the Spine to the Clock of Omens to untap Slobad ad infinitum. And then the last card that helps enable the Spine of Ish-Sa Clock of Omens thing is a little bit of a weird card. It's Farid, Enterprising Salvager, which is 2 in a red for a legendary creature, Human Soldier. It's a 3/3. Farid says, whenever a non-token artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, create a colorless artifact token named Scrap. 1 in a red, sacrifice an artifact, choose 1. Put a +1/+1 counter on Farid. It gains menace until end of turn. Goad target creature, or discard a card, then draw a card. So Farid is an interesting card in this deck because it lets you sacrifice like the little baubles to, help you loot through your deck, maybe keep a big creature off of you. It also gives you artifact tokens whenever you sacrifice thing to Slobad, and that's what we're really interested in, because if you have the Spine of Ish-Sa and Farid out, then you don't need any of the other pieces, because then whenever you sacrifice the Spine to Slobad, Farid will make an untapped artifact token, and then you can replay the Spine, use the untapped Scrap token and the Spine in order to untap Slobad. So Farid, super helpful with the Clock of Omens loops. So now that we've talked about 2 ways to untap Slobad, now we're going to talk about a 3rd way to untap Slobad, since that is what the deck is all about. It's tapping, untapping Slobad. So the last way to untap Slobad is the Thornbite Staff, which is 2 mana for a tribal artifact, a shaman equipment. It says equipped creature has 2 mana, tap it. This creature deals 1 damage to target creature or player, and whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from play, untap this creature. Whenever a shaman creature comes into play, you may attach Thornbite Staff to it, equip for 4. Unfortunately, Slobad is not a shaman, so you don't get the free equip, but the Thornbite Staff will untap Slobad whenever you sacrifice an artifact creature, and luckily we have a couple of artifact creatures, the Retrievers, which will get each other back whenever you sacrifice them. So it's the same loop as before with the Dross Scorpion and turning Slobad into an artifact, except this one requires like a couple of less pieces because you just need the Thornbite Staff and then 2 of the Retrievers, and then that also goes infinite in of itself. So the last part of the main combos section would be some of my favorite combos, KCI loops. And if you're not familiar with KCI, it's an acronym for the Krork Clan Ironworks, which is 4 mana for an artifact. It's very simple. It just says sacrifice an artifact, add 2 mana to your mana pool. So the way that KCI loops work is, and if you are a fan of the modern format, then you probably already know what this card is. I actually used to play it in modern. I'm really disappointed that it got the axe. So you have Krork Clan Ironworks, and then what you need are about 5-6 pieces, including the Krork Clan Ironworks, which sounds like a lot, but many of them are really interchangeable. So the first card that you need is the Krork Clan Ironworks, obviously. The second card that you need is the Scrap Trawler. Scrap Trawler is 3 mana for an artifact construct. For an artifact creature construct, it's a 3/2. It says whenever Scrap Trawler or another artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return to your hand target artifact card in your graveyard with lesser mana value. So you need Krork Clan Ironworks, Scrap Trawler, and then any one of the retrieving creatures. Mirror Retriever works the best just because it has the lowest cost. And then you need an artifact that has a CMC greater than Mirror Retriever. Anything will do. Any artifact that has CMC greater than Mirror Retriever or whatever retrieving creature you have will work. So for this example, we can just use the Patriarch Seal, which it's just a mana rock. So how this works is you can sacrifice the Patriarch Seal to Krork Clan Ironworks. This gives you 2 colorless mana. Then you can sacrifice the Mirror Retriever to Krork Clan Ironworks. This gives you 3 triggers overall. Patriarch Seal Scrap Trawler's trigger to get back a 2 CMC artifact, and then Mirror Retriever's trigger to get back anything that you want, and then Mirror Retriever's Scrap Trawler trigger to get back a 1 CMC artifact. So what happens is the Patriarch Seal going to the graveyard gets you back the Mirror Retriever, and the Mirror Retriever gets you back the Patriarch Seal. Well, with any of the other triggers that you have from Scrap Trawler, you can get back 1 CMC and lower artifacts to then sacrifice 2 Krork Clan Ironworks in order to get additional mana to replay those cards and keep the loop going. And this works with any of the other retrievers. You just need another artifact that has mana value. I cannot believe that I just said mana value. That has converted mana cost greater than the retriever. So if you use Junk Diver, which is 3 mana, you need a 4 mana artifact, like the Slagstone Refinery. So you sacrifice the Slagstone Refinery, you sacrifice the Junk Diver, Slagstone Refinery Scrap Trawler trigger gets back the Junk Diver gets back the Slagstone Refinery, and then the Junk Diver Scrap Trawler trigger can get you back the Patriarch Seal even. And then you just replay all those artifacts, sacrifice all of them again, keep going down the chain. And you want to keep going down the chain with, other mana rocks, other cheap artifacts. You can use things like Mind Stone. You can use things like Fire Diamond. You can use things like Pyrite Spellbomb, Soul Ring, Voltaic Key. all of these will sacrifice to the Crockclay and Ironworks in order to get you more mana, and then they'll return themselves to your hand whenever you sacrifice your other artifacts with the Scrap Trawler. So that's it for all of the main combos of the deck. Now the question is, how do we find them? Because as I said earlier, red doesn't find cards. There are about 2 cards that I really found that actually search for a specific card in red other than Gamble. Unless you're playing highly competitive Commander, I kind of think Gamble is a little bit of a trap, which is why it is not included in this deck. So the first tutor, and it's not a terrible one, it's the Goblin Engineer. It's 1 in a red for a creature, Goblin Artificer. It's a 1/2. When Goblin Engineer enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an artifact card, put it into your graveyard, then shuffle your library. For a red, tap, sacrifice an artifact, return target artifact card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this just straight entombs an artifact, and then with any of the other cards that we have in the deck, the Goblin Welder or Daretti Scrap Savant, you can just put it back into play. And then the other one is the Inventor's Fair, which is a land that says, it's a legendary land. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 3 or more artifacts, you gain 1 life. Tap, add colorless to your mana pool. 4, tap, sacrifice Inventor's Fair, search your library for an artifact card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. Activate this ability only if you control 3 or more artifacts, which is really not going to be an issue at all. So, white finds enchantments and some artifacts. Blue finds spells and artifacts. Green finds creatures. Black finds whatever it wants. Red really doesn't find anything. So this means that we have to get creative with how we find any of our pieces, or even just try to power out more artifacts. So red has this funny ability in its color pie where it destroys things or sacrifices things and then flip cards off the top until you get something else of that. And one of the main cards that does this, and it's highly played in many formats, is Indomitable Creativity. It is X and triple red for a sorcery. Destroy X target artifacts and or creatures. For each permanent destroyed this way, its controller reveals cards from the top of his or her library until an artifact or creature card is revealed and exiles that card. Those players put the exiled cards onto the battlefield, then shuffle their libraries. So, Indomitable Creativity for 1, you get rid of an Ichor Wellspring. Then you reveal cards from the top of your deck until you reveal a Voltaic Key. And then you put Voltaic Key into play. And then you put all the cards that you revealed back into your deck and shuffle. So, it's very spin to win. You might hit really good cards. You might not hit really good cards. That's kind of the upside and downside of playing Indomitable Creativity here. But with a lot of the cheap baubles that we're running, Chromatic Star, Implement of Combustion, Ichor Wellspring, Mycosynth Wellspring, all of those kinds of things, you can just target all of them and then flip cards from the top of your deck until you get some of the other artifact cards. And maybe you don't hit very well. Maybe you get like a Battered Golem, maybe you just get, the Thrawn Spider, and then you get a Terrarian. But you could also hit really, really well. You could hit Grinding Station, Clock of Omens, and Spinavish Saw. And then with Slobad, if you already have a Mycosynth Wellspring out or a Liquid Metal Torque, you could just go infinite. And there are several other cards that do this as well. You have Indomitable Creativity, you have Chaotic Transformation, which is the new one from Dominaria. It's 5 and a red for a sorcery. Exile up to 1 target artifact, up to 1 target creature, up to 1 target enchantment, up to 1 target planeswalker, and or up to 1 target land. For each permanent exiled this way, its controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a card that shares a card type with it, puts that card onto the battlefield, then shuffles. So, it's 6 mana to get rid of an artifact, but this could also hit your opponent's cards, and so can Indomitable Creativity. It might not be as good hitting your opponent's cards, but that's what these cards are kind of originally used for. It's Red's way of removing very problematic cards. It's very on brand. Chaos Warp is very similar to this. So you can Chaotic Transformation 2 of your own things and then 3 of your opponent's own things, and then just see what happens. The other one that is very much a gamble is the Madcap Experiment, which is 3 in a red for a sorcery. It says reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal an artifact card. Put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Madcap Experiment deals damage to you equal to the number of cards revealed this way. So if you're at 3 and you cast Madcap Experiment, you could very well just lose. If you're at 40, if you're at 35, your odds of revealing 10, 20 cards are pretty low. So, Madcap Experiment can be very good, it can be very bad. Audacious Reshapers is also very similar to this. 2 in a red for a creature, human artificer, a 3/3. Tap, sacrifice an artifact. Reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal an artifact card. Put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Audacious Reshapers deals damage to you equal to the number of cards revealed this way. So, the Audacious Reshapers, Madcap Experiment, Chaotic Transformation, Indomitable Creativity, these are all very random ways to just spin into more artifacts, which, without the ability to draw a lot of cards, which Red kind of lacks because of the whole looting thing, and the lack of tutors, you kind of really just want to take what you can get. The best one out of these is, I think, Saheeli's Directive, which is X, triple red for a sorcery, and it has Improvise. So each artifact you tap after you're done activating mana abilities pays for 1. So you can reveal the top X cards of your library. You may put any number of artifact cards with converting mana cost X or less from among them onto the battlefield. Then put all cards revealed this way that weren't put onto the battlefield into your graveyard. So you could lose out on some land drops, some removal, but for the most part, you're going to hit like all of your most important pieces with Saheeli's Directive. And if you have a ton of artifacts out, you can tap all of them to Saheeli's Directive in order to just pump a bunch of mana into it, maybe reveal the top 8, 10, 20 cards of your library. Okay, maybe 20 is pushing it, maybe 12. You just reveal all of those cards, put a bunch of combo pieces into play, maybe even go off on the same turn. So, now that we know what the combos of the deck are, now that we have the ability to find the combos, it's now imperative that we win the game. We have to actually win the game. So the first 2 ways to win the game is the Reckless Fireweaver and the Audacious, or not the Audacious Reshapers, the Ingenious Artillerist. Both of these cards say, whenever artifacts enter the battlefield, deal damage to each opponent. So, if you have Mycos and Flatus, if you have Spine of Ishsaw, Clock of Omens, that loop going, every time you play Spine of Ishsaw, sure, you get to destroy a permanent, and if you just destroy all your opponent's permanents for the rest of the game, they'll probably just concede and you can beat them down somehow. But you also, with these 2 cards, have the ability to deal infinite damage to your opponents. Both of these also work whenever you perform a Retriever loop. They work alongside of KCI. They are just ways of helping you get there. They just kind of sit, and during any number of any of your combo turns, they just win you the game. A weird one is the Ghirapur Ether Grid. It's 2 in a red for an enchantment. It says tap 2 untapped artifacts you control. Ghirapur Ether Grid deals 1 damage to target creature or player. So the weird thing about Ghirapur Ether Grid is that it requires 2 untapped artifacts you control to actually deal infinite damage. So depending on the artifacts you have available, depending on the loop that you're performing, you could win with this during a combo. So if you're doing some kind of Retriever loop with Slobad and you have Farid, I think the name is. Yeah, Farid. Then whenever you sacrifice a Retriever, you make a scrap. Well, you can tap the scrap and the Retriever to deal a damage to your opponents. and then you sacrifice the retriever to get back the other one, play it, then you have 2 untapped artifacts again because you just made another scrap. So that's like an example of where gear per Aether Grid could come into play, deal infinite damage. Another way to close out the game, and this is specific for KCI loops, is the Pyrite Spellbomb. So Pyrite Spellbomb is 1 mana for an artifact. Red, sacrifice Pyrite Spellbomb. It deals 2 damage to any target. 1, sacrifice Pyrite Spellbomb, draw a card. So a cheap cantrip that you can play early, but with the KCI loops, getting back, 1 mana cards, if you have the ability to make red mana during that whole loop, which you do if you have the Patriarch Seal or the Mox Opal, then you have the ability to make the infinite red mana in order to infinitely get back Pyrite Spellbomb and infinitely deal damage to your opponents. Some other ways to win include Grinding Station. With certain loops, you can sacrifice an artifact, target player puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. You can infinitely mill your opponents. During certain loops, the Blasting Station also works. You can tap, sacrifice a creature, Blasting Station deals 1 damage to target creature or player. Another way to deal infinite damage to your opponents. Spine of Ish-Saw is technically a win condition. Your opponents really can't do much if they don't have any permanents. And a really cool one, actually, is the Quicksmith Rebel. It's 3 and a red for a creature, a human artificer. When Quicksmith Rebel enters the battlefield, target artifact you control gains tap. This artifact deals 2 damage to a target creature or player for as long as you control Quicksmith Rebel. So this comes into play, and then just any random artifact that you have just becomes tap 2 damage to a creature or player. So the Draw Scorpion can untap that artifact. You can use Clock of Omens and things like Batter Golem to untap that artifact. So there's just lots of ways to actually close out the game with this deck. Some other cool cards that I wanted to highlight before I wrap it up is Scrap Mastery. It's 3 a red and a red for a sorcery. Each player exiles all artifact cards from their graveyard, then sacrifices all artifacts they control, then puts all cards they exiled this way onto the battlefield. Red is a little lacking in super efficient ways to get artifacts back from the graveyard. There are plenty of ways to do it, but Scrap Mastery just adds that extra consistency. It's a living death for artifacts. So you can sacrifice your entire board to Slobad and then just play Scrap Mastery and put everything from your graveyard back onto the battlefield that is an artifact. It's just a very nice way to be able to get all of your artifacts back, to be able to kind of reset your board after sacrificing it. Another really, really cool card is the Smelting Vat. It's 4 mana for an artifact. It says 1 tap, sacrifice another artifact, reveal the top 8 cards of your library. Put up to 2 non-creature artifact cards with total mana value less than or equal to the sacrificed artifact's mana value from among them onto the battlefield, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So I really like this card. I said earlier that red doesn't have a lot of tutors. It doesn't have a lot of super efficient card draw. So just being able to kind of turbo out more cards from the top of your deck. And it's 8 cards. That's almost a tenth of your library every time you sacrifice another artifact. So you could very easily sacrifice some really big artifacts. The Metalcore Colossus, the Spine of Ish-Saw, Salvaging Station, Summoning Station even, in order to power out some other artifacts from the Smelting Vat. Help you look for those other pieces that you're missing. Another really cool card, and I am so very high on this card. I really love this card. It's Pia's Revolution. It's 2 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever a non-token artifact is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, return that card to your hand unless target opponent has Pia's Revolution deal 3 damage to him or her. Alongside of your damage-dealing creatures, the Ingenious Artillerist and the Reckless Fireweaver, Pia's Revolution can do some serious damage to your opponents, and at a certain point, they might not even want to pay that additional life anymore and just let you have the artifact. They could be too low, at which point you just continue playing your artifacts, continue sacrificing them. Your opponents just continue not paying the damage and just putting it back in your hand. So Pia's Revolution is a really great way to just keep your artifacts flowing. Another really good one is the Scarecrow. It is 3 mana for an artifact creature, a Scarecrow. It's 1, sacrifice a Scarecrow, draw a card. 4, tap, return target artifact creature card from your graveyard to play. It's a 1/2. So, like I said a couple of times earlier, red is a little bit tricky at really getting artifacts back from your graveyard to the battlefield. So I thought that Scarecrow would be a really good addition because Scarecrow puts any of your retrieving creatures directly back into play, and then your retrieving creatures, when sacrificed, get you back pretty much anything. And you can use all of that mana that you make with Slobad by sacrificing artifacts to pump into the Scarecrow in order to return those artifact creatures back into play. And the last cool card is the Metalwork Colossus. It is 11 mana for an artifact creature, a construct. It's a 10/10. Metalwork Colossus costs X to cast, where X is the total converted mana cost of non-creature artifacts you control. Sacrifice 2 artifacts, return Metalwork Colossus from your graveyard to your hand. So, if you have Farid, if you have the Slagstone Refinery, and if you have enough other artifacts, you can just sacrifice Metalwork Colossus to all kinds of different things, and then use the tokens that you make to just put it back in your hand, replay it, sack it, replay it, sack it, replay it, sack it. This is also a really good mana sink for Slobad. You can sacrifice the Metalwork Colossus to Slobad to just make a ton of red mana, and then sacrifice artifacts to just replay it, or to even help you power out some of your other really big artifacts. So you can sacrifice the Metalwork Colossus, maybe you even played it for free or for 1 or 2 that turn, get 11 mana, play out a whole summoning station and a scrap trawler and some other stuff because you just made 11 red mana. So this card, I think that this card is a really good addition to this deck. So this week, no all things considered for this week. I actually think that I put a lot of time and effort into this deck. I actually think that it's really, really cool. I am considering almost building it myself just because red artifacts are so cool. You just get to sacrifice them a bunch, return them, deal tons of damage to your opponents. I think that Slobad is a really interesting card, getting you to sacrifice artifacts to add mana to their mana value, returning them back to your hand, untapping Slobad, replaying them, just closing out the game in a super cool way. So, let me know what you think of Slobad. Is he worthy of his own commander deck? Are there just other better versions of Slobad? Are there better mono red commanders? Let me know. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think of Slobad. Let me know what you thought of the episode. And tune in next time when we enter the